Well, folks, welcome here. Welcome to St. Mark's College and the Center for Christian Engagement. My name is John Martins, and I direct the Center for Christian Engagement. I want to welcome all of you here tonight to the lecture Bioethics and Environmental Ethics, our annual Jesuit lecture. I don't know that we have an official title for it other than that, but it's always good to have a Jesuit. This year it's offered by Myles Sheehan, who is not just SJ, but also MD, a medical doctor and a priest. I'll share a few words about our guests shortly, but first I want to thank you for traveling to be with us on an unusually wet day in Vancouver, am I right? Thanks for being on our beautiful campus on the land of the Musqueam people, on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. We're thankful for their welcome to us. I want to offer some thanks and gratitude for those who have sponsored this lecture that allows us to examine the complexities of bioethics today. We're thankful to the Cullen family, Mark and Barbara, for their generous support of our lecture series. I want to thank our donors to the Center for Christian Engagement, Peter Bull, Angus Reid, and Andy Zox, and we're thankful to their commitment to the academic world and to the work of the church in the world. And thanks also to a number of you who've donated to the CCE on your own, and we appreciate that. A couple of housekeeping matters for those of you who don't know this venue well. To my left and down the stairs are the washrooms. I also want to remind you and welcome you that following our lecture, we will have refreshments. And we'll have a question period after the lecture and then refreshments. So please stay for some food and community. I now want to introduce our speaker. Father Sheehan will speak, as I mentioned, on bioethics and environmental ethics. And he's perfectly positioned to tackle these topics. He is a Jesuit priest, as I mentioned, a physician and an ethicist, and since December 2020, the director of the Pellegrino Center for Clinical Bioethics at Georgetown University, where he also serves as professor of medicine and the David Lawler Chair of Catholic Healthcare Ethics. He's a graduate of Dartmouth College and Dartmouth Medical School, and he trained in a number of areas, including internal medicine and geriatrics. And he's practiced in these areas for a number of years. At this point, he's too busy to continue to practice medicine, but he remains involved at Georgetown as the director of the Pellegrino Center. He was ordained to the priesthood in 1994 and pronounced final vows in the society in 2005. He also served as a provincial for the New England province of the Society of Jesus from 2015 to 2021. And I only laughed a little bit there because he seems very busy to me and very accomplished, quite amazing. So we're really lucky, I think, and blessed to have him here with us. So won't you please give him a warm welcome, Father Sheehan.
Thank you, John, and thank you all for coming out on such a lovely evening. I know you probably wanted to dine outside tonight or something like that, but you know, you think I'm just giving this guest lecture, but actually after the results of the 2 primaries in the United States, I'm actually doing this as a job interview. So we'll see what will happen from there. What I hope to do is talk for about 40 to 45 minutes and give some time for questions if you like that. And hopefully we'll go from there. So Kevin, would you be so kind as to start us off? Thank you. And so what I'd like to do is to review some of the early foundations of environmental ethics and bioethics and show how they began together and then there was a little bit of a split. There are some critiques of bioethics that came out of that which are probably useful but not entirely accurate. Talk about possible relations of clinical bioethics to environmental ethics, and then I'm going to talk about the work of somebody I don't know, a young woman named Christina Ricci, who wrote a book called Green Bioethics. I think it was her PhD thesis in theology at Boston College. She currently teaches in North Carolina, I think at Bauman Gray, I'm not sure. And then talk about some new ideas they've been having about vulnerability as a way to look at this, and then I hope we can have a discussion about some of the new ways we look at bioethics. Let me just explain a little bit more about what I do. I stopped practicing medicine in 2009 when I became provincial because I couldn't do both at that point. And so, but I am still very involved in work at the hospital because we have an active bioethics consult service. We saw about 140 patients last year. And so it's fairly busy, so I am involved with medical things. And the Pellegrino Center, this is sort of Georgetown history. The Kennedy Institute of Ethics started in the 70s. It was, as the name suggests, a grant from the Kennedy family. And it was originally looking at particular issues of care related to folks who had intellectual disabilities. Over time, a number of things happened that were good. And the center sort of exploded in terms of being one of the big centers, particularly in the States, to look at this evolving field of bioethics. The institute that I run, the Pellegrino Center for Clinical Bioethics, there was a man, Edmund Pellegrino, who was a physician in the States and also a philosopher. He did a number of things. He was president of Catholic University America. He came over to Kennedy Institute of Ethics. And then in time, the Kennedy Institute's focus became more theoretical, more philosophical, and he moved over to the medical center to start what was then the Center for Clinical Bioethics, focusing more on what happened within healthcare. So the first pass of this talk I did for a seminar with the members of the faculty of the Kennedy Institute and the Pellegrino Center. And it was shortly after I came in, so I wanted to learn the history of the place. So that's why I started to do this. And I was surprised to stumble on, there was a lot of controversy and criticism of, when I say KIE, it's the Kennedy Institute of Ethics, and what it called the four principles approach as part of this topic. Back in the 70s, early 80s, for any of you who've studied medical ethics, there's a sort of a famous book by Beecham and Childress called Principles of Biomedical Ethics. And there is what is sometimes called derisively the Georgetown mantra when you look at an ethical problem. So you think about autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. And those four principles are considered sort of prima facie ways in which you would analyze an ethical situation within healthcare. As I talk about some of this, I'm going to be superficial because I'm going through a lot of history, but I hope they can have some dialogue. But the part that over the last few years has made me think of how within bioethics, as opposed to simply having a very narrow focus, we can open up a little bit of things to also look at things really affect the lives of our patients. I mean, this exploded quite literally in 2020 with the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. We see this happening with a number of different things, and in particular, looking now at the influence of the environment on the care of the people who come to us. So how did this business of bioethics started? Actually, the first time bioethics apparently shows up in the literature is with a German Lutheran pastor by the name of Fritz Jahr, who in 1927 coined the term bioethic. We see it again in 1947 with a lovely little book, I don't know if anyone's ever read it, called A Sand County Almanac, which was written by a man called Leonard Leopold. And it's still in print, and it's a beautiful little book, and it's about his time in a particular part of Wisconsin where he just would look at the marshes, look at the wildlife, pay attention about that. And he came up with an ethic, and we'll talk a bit more about it later, about looking at what is good for the land, what's good for a particular environment. And then again, Rachel Carson in 1962, some of you might remember that name, with the book Silent Spring, which became very famous and really brought people's awareness about the risks associated with DDT in particular, and other use of pesticides and the impact on life. There was a man who people don't know about who actually was very important by the name of von Rensselaer Porter, and he was a biochemist and a cancer researcher at the University of Wisconsin. And he emphasized what I call a holistic approach that looked at the importance of protecting life on Earth and developments in medical science. So he really linked bioethics to the environment at a time very early in the development of this field. And he wanted to look at threats to human survival, biological insights, human values, and addressing issues related to population growth, and how we dealt with these threats to human flourishing. He had a broader approach than looking at individuals, but he considered environmental ethics and other biological concerns in a global perspective. Now, Andre Hellegers became the first head of the Kennedy Institute in the late 70s. He was a Belgian OBGYN guy and had been a expert on actually the placenta, which was the field of study, and he spent years at Johns Hopkins. And he really presided over this flourishing that happened in the development of what was called the Georgetown model, with introducing a notion of bioethics that dealt with concrete medical dilemmas restricted to 3 areas. So the rights and duties of patient and health professionals, the rights and duties of research subject and researchers, the formulation of public policy guidelines for clinical care and biomedical research. You may or may not be familiar with a thing called the Belmont Report that came out in the 60s in the United States. It was related to work that was done by investigators using people with intellectual disabilities, and involved in other things that were shocking. The Belmont Report is sometimes seen as a furthering of looking at what had happened with Nuremberg and the Germans' horrible use of medical research, as well as the absolute horrible things that was done with the Tuskegee trial in the United States, as well as other things in Guatemala. So they were looking at particularly the rights and duties of patients and health professionals. And this was, again, if you think about the 70s, people were no longer willing to say, oh yes, in response to authority. There was a big change with that. It wasn't just if the doctor told you that, you were going to go, okay. And again, I can remember my dad was an anesthesiologist, and it would be the situation that if a woman was thought to have a breast malignancy, he was an anesthesiologist, he would put her under anesthesia lightly, a frozen section would be done, and then the husband would be asked about what surgery should be done. So I mean, that was the way things were going back in the 60s. The research subjects and researchers, that really came out again out of some of the things from World War II in the Belmont Report, and then to look at clinical care. But here's the part that was different to the Georgetown model with what Van Rensselaer-Porter talked about. He thought about bioethics was in some ways linked to the approach to the search for wisdom, for a knowledge that would make us look at what were good judgments as to what would constitute physical, cultural, and philosophical progress toward a valued survival. The Georgetown model, on the other hand, sought to resolve concrete moral problems and then coherent application of established and universally valid ethical principles. They're really 2 different ways at looking, in a certain sense, different issues. I think what the Georgetown model was looking at, it was clear that there were a variety of ways in which the standard medical model was not treating people like grown-ups, and that was a problem that needed to be addressed. I think that Van Rensselaer-Porter was looking at much larger issues that in the same way did not get the attention. And here's the other part. There was a lot of funding for the medical stuff, and there wasn't for the broader approach. There is ethicist Jessica Pierce, who said that those 4 traditional principles of bioethics, again, the autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, justice, business, aren't adequate. Without the broader view, we don't look at things like sustainability, balance, adequacy, and diversity. And then I'm going to talk about this guy, Hank ten Have, who's a Dutch philosopher and ethicist. He talks about, again, a lot of the focus has been on trying to improve the autonomy of the patient, to empower the individual in the context of science and technology. But again, too often we treat patients sort of as just brains that happen to have a body around, and don't pay attention to the fact that these are embodied human beings. And so the discourse needs to go beyond the individual perspective and address human vulnerability, and that's some of the things I'll talk about in the end. Now, a couple things, just my comment here is that, you know, this clinical bioethics and the stuff that happened in Georgetown, and it's fine if you criticize Georgetown, I don't care. I went there in 2020. It's probably my last stop in the academic pathway. That's fine. So clinical bioethics did take over an enormous share of bioethics, and it did a lot of good. It brought a new approach to thinking, and it brought a new insight into new questions. And I'm not sure, you know, this is the kind of thing that academics do all the time. They find a straw man to kick down and say, therefore the other person is better. I think these are 2 different strands that develop. The stuff with Van Rensselaer-Porter, which didn't develop as quickly, but now is being looked at again. And then the importance of also looking at what happens concretely in the healthcare environment. But again, I think that this idea that bioethics is more than simply those 4 principles is a valuable insight. Now, Christine Ritchie, who I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to show you a lot of her slides, a lot of slides that I came up from her work. And I'm not sure if it's going to be available here, but if folks can access, this book is on free online through some academic environments, so I don't know if you'll be able to get it. But it's an interesting book. And here's another thing. I'm going to talk about ways it isn't perfect, but I think it was a great idea. You know, again, it's the easy thing as an academic to say, oh, here's why this person is wrong, as opposed to saying, boy, that was a really great idea. I can quibble with you here and there. Let's take it further. Let's do that. This is fantastic stuff. So what she writes about in her introduction is the era of the Anthropocene, that is the human era, the complex interface of resource use and industrialized healthcare needs something more structured than the current models of environmental bioethics. It requires a biomedical ethic driven by the concerns of environmental ethics. Through 4 principles, and she takes over, she sort of like adapts the 4 principles. Green bioethics can bridge remaining gaps in environmental bioethics by addressing sustainability, techniques, and procedures. And the term green bioethics indicates points of convergence and divergence with environmental ethics and biomedical ethics, while also extending the environmental bioethics tradition. Now, if you were to look at healthcare, traditionally environmental ethics mainly looks at the big carbon footprint of healthcare. In the United States, about 9% of carbon emissions come from healthcare. And it's not surprising. It's not like people are doing evil things, but you have to have the lights on 24 hours. You have to have heat or air conditioning 24 hours. You have to use an enormous amount of water to keep a hospital going. And then particular problem is with anesthesia, although this is changing. They use a lot of volatile gases that could have negative environmental effects. So there are a variety of different particular challenges that just the physical structure of healthcare causes to the environment. And environmental ethics looks at that in ways that are quite useful and actually are rapidly changing in terms of how hospitals are built, how you do different things, etc. What Dr. Ritchie goes on and talks about, that she says green bioethics takes a circumscribed approach to biomedical ethics by emphasizing the sustainability of medical developments, techniques, and procedures. But she says that green bioethics and bioethics have a similar scope of medical developments, techniques, and procedures. The ethical priorities and principles that are utilized to guide decision-making are distinctive. And again, I think this is an interesting way to look at. I don't view, when I do my ethics work in the hospital, that I'm that thrilled about looking necessarily at developments, techniques, and procedures. I'm interested in relationships. And I'm interested in trying to figure out what is going on with the patient and how we can find, as Dr. Pellegrino would say, the right and good healing action for the person in front of them. And that relies on doing a lot of talking with the patient, with the family, with the doctor, and stuff like that. So again, there are things I would quibble with, but I don't want to be a jerk and not suggest this isn't great work. Now, what about green bioethics and morality? Dr. Ritchie says it's not going to express the common morality of individualist bioethic methods, ethics, which happens in the West, but again, try to look at an uncommon morality that reflects the origins of Van Rensselaer-Porter's bioethics. This complex interface of environmental and biomedical ethics requires something more creative and interdisciplinary than the current approaches. It requires an approach to the scope of traditional bioethics driven by the concerns of environmental ethics. And she has what she calls a principled framework. And so she talks about developments, techniques, procedures that can reduce consumption and thus are environmentally sustainable. Currently, there are other things that are not sustainable. And so she talks about the Leopold imperative, referring back to that guy, Leopold with the Sand County Almanac, that a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. So what are her 4 principles of green bioethics? The first is distributive justice. In other words, you allocate basic medical resources before special interest access. So, you know, people are going to get cancer surgery before they get cosmetic surgery. You know, one way to look at it. Research conservation, patient healthcare needs before healthcare wants. The third is simplicity, to reduce dependence on medical interventions. And then the fourth is ethical economics, with looking at humanistic healthcare instead of financial profit. Now, I realize that there's a different healthcare system in Canada than the United States. I'm not thrilled with my healthcare system in the United States. I don't know how you feel about your healthcare system in Canada. But again, there are different ways to look at these things. Again, a criticism I'd say is, she's trying to come up with a way to come up with a framework. She obviously has to simplify things. There are a lot of simplifications in here. That's fine. She's trying to create a tool. Now, she talks about something called the green patient, with individual patients might choose to abstain from medical developments, techniques, and procedures that only a small percentage of the global population can access. So if you're in Canada, the United States, you say, I'm not going to do that because people in other parts of the world might not have it. We'll see. Research conservation ensure when individuals choose healthcare needs from a position of relationality. In other words, utilizing medical developments, techniques, and procedures from an interconnected rather than an egocentric perspective will temper resource use. And this is a little link to what comes up later when I talk about vulnerability with Henk ten Have. Simplicity occurs when individuals make an effort to prevent disease and take personal responsibility for their health. And then ethical economics can be employed through financial sharing of medical expenses, meaning that you'd accept surcharges on medical goods that would be put towards humanistic health care. So, I mean, this would be a way you might look at procedures that might be a medical want rather than a need, and the people who are going to pay for them, they're going to pay a lot so that they can pay for basic coverage for others. And she talks about a green doctor who would practice distributive justice, advocating redistribution of doctors through incentives, loan forgiveness, and policies that support doctors pursuing work in medical deserts. I don't know if you have those in Canada. We have those in the United States, where there are large areas where people don't want to practice, or there are only a few physicians there. It can be partly because the areas are rural. It's not the easiest place to raise a family. It might be that the area is urban and underdeveloped and a little unsafe, and so somebody doesn't want to be there. And it can also be that it's hard to be a physician if there aren't others around to help out, not only with the demands of coverage, but also with the, I don't know if this is a dirty little secret, but doctors often call their friends and say, I'm not sure what to do. What do you think? And it's hard to do that when you don't have people around to talk to. Simplicity can occur when gradational approaches to technological interventions are utilized, especially when a low resource alternative to treatments abound. I mean, here's the thing. So I grew up, graduated from medical school in '81. We had the first CT scans. I am teaching medical students at Harvard in 1994, and they cannot tell me where the lesion is on the basis of a neurologic exam because the CT scan's broken. So, you know, it's just like, come on, come on, come on. The CT scan machine wasn't working one night. This was not at the hospital where I did my residency, but a place we had to cover. A patient came in who had mixed findings with a stroke, looking like he couldn't move one side, but had decreased sensation on the other. And the resident said, he's obviously faking. I said, no, he's had a brainstem stroke. The residents made a big mistake and anticoagulated him, and he died as a consequence of that. It was the kind of thing when you didn't need the CT scan. You needed to do an exam, and you needed to think. So ethical economics encourages doctors to provide humanitarian medicine instead of financial lucrative non-medical services, only utilize resources when they are necessary. I don't know if you have this in Canada, but in the United States, if you go to a dermatologist's office, there's a good chance he or she is going to try to sell you a whole bunch of stuff. You know, here's my fancy new skin cream, here's my beautiful hair shampoo, here's this. That's sort of funny. Now, if you're in like the middle of Montana and the doctor has the ability to have a small pharmacy and says, you have a bad infection, here's a prescription for Augmentin, here's my cost, here's your cost. You know, I'm not charging you for it over above what I have to pay. That doesn't bother me. But if the doctor says, here are my magic vitamins, and I'm your doctor, and what do you mean you're not going to buy them? That stinks. That stinks, you know? It shouldn't be like when you got to go buy a car and you know somebody's going to drive the bill up on you. That shouldn't be the way where it goes when you see the doctor. Now, let's just come up with some response. I made them. I think using needs as a criterion for distributing goods has problems. I'm sympathetic to it because we can all think of basic needs, but what's the overlap between needs and wants? And that can get very complicated quickly. conservation of resources as a reason for limiting treatment, it's hard to apply in individual cases. And so if someone needs extraordinary resources, do I say you can't have it so other people can? I don't think the physician at the bedside should be making rationing decisions for the person in front of him or her, because my job is to try to do what I think is the best for him or her based on our discussion. And likewise, when you have government make some of those decisions, it can be clunky, as we see in both our countries. Simplicity has appeal, but it might be tough to discern. So for instance, when I did geriatrics, people didn't quite know what to make of me in the hospital, because I often would say, you've done enough, this is too much. The person's frail, they're very elderly. If you do this surgery, you're crazy. It's not going to do anything. But I would have very healthy people in their 80, and I'm sending them for hip replacements and knee replacements. The reason I was doing that is because based on their physiologic age, they had 10 to 15 years to go. I didn't want them to have crippling osteoarthritis, which meant that they were going to lose their ability to get around. So I was trying to use medical resources to add life to years rather than just years to life. Was that simplicity? I don't know. Humanitarian medicine, rather than financially lucrative and non-essential services, again, is appealing. But there are times, again, we can think of the distinction as straightforward. In other words, you know, if we were to look at, say, looking to mitigate coronary artery disease and other risks like that, then what do we do for the segment of the population that is having the worst kind of problems in their 60s and 70s? Because then that's going to need interventional medicine. It's not to keep everybody alive to their 100, but it's to keep them alive in a good way until they're in their 80s or a bit beyond. So again, what's humanitarian? Do you make more money doing the procedures? Yeah, but it doesn't necessarily mean that's your focus. And here's about being a green patient. I'd like to think that if, God forbid, I needed a liver transplant, I would say, no way, I'm going to be 68 in April. Let somebody else have the liver. You know, I've had a good life. There's no kids that need to worry about me. I don't have any grandkids. And I can say now I'd be looking forward to see if the way I base my life turns out to be right. Maybe when I'm confronted with a serious illness, I'll feel otherwise. But the part is, it does require a degree of self-effacement and altruism that I think in the face of a serious diagnosis, it might be hard for people to say, oh no, let's share resources. You know, I have had plenty of older patients say, oh, that's stupid, that's a waste of money. You know, I'm 85, I'm this, I'm that. You know, that's ridiculous. And then again, when they talk about being a green doctor, I think there's a lot of humanistic idealism, which I think is a great thing. But again, it's that questionable power over individual patient choices. You know, how can I say, oh no, we have to conserve resources across a population, so I'm not going to allow you to have the procedure that is potentially life-saving? That's tough. And I don't think doctors have that expertise or should have that authority. And Edmund Pellegrino said the physician's autonomy as a physician is also limited when she mistakes medical expertise and authority for expertise in questions of value. By that he means the physician has no standing as an expert in human values and no authority to set goals or priorities of public policy relative to the allocation or distribution of healthcare resources. But the actual choice of values are not the prerogative of physicians or any other experts, politicians, economists, or even ethicists. Social value questions are a matter of concern for the whole of society. And one of the things is he didn't think he thought physicians were ultimately concerned about value. That's part of his whole notion of the morality of medicine. But what he thought is that the physician does not have a trump card to decide another person's values. And he also don't think that politicians or economists or ethicists, that the values that people have are part of who they are. And that, again, we can look at social value questions over the whole of society, but you shouldn't be doing it at the bedside. Now, here's another perspective, and talking about vulnerability, and I've sort of I was talking to John just before. This talk keeps on evolving. In the next iteration, there's going to be more vulnerability, and I'm going to bring in Laudato Si and Laudato Deum, which I haven't done in this talk, because the talk in its first iteration was for a bunch of philosophers who don't want to hear any stinking religion. So, and so I'm going to work on it in time, so I know that this is a big lack in this particular thing. And so that's the reference at the top of it. And what Tenhave talks about is vulnerability as a fundamental part of being human. What's vulnerability? It's a sort of a easy thing to say we're all vulnerable, right? COVID showed that in a very special way. Vulnerability also differs in terms of particular aspects of an individual. So if they have an underlying illness or if they're elderly, etc. Vulnerability can be changed on other aspects. I was laughing the other day, we had our coldest day in Washington yet. It was about 18. And so, sorry for being Fahrenheit. The stupid kids on the football team, the boys are all there out, all being macho just in their gym shorts with their shirt off, and it was 18. So, I mean, these are big, beefy boys. They're not vulnerable to the cold in the same way. They're running around, they're having a hell of a time, they're going to go have a hot shower, they'll be okay. But if you put other people out there in their gym shorts, and they're going to be in big trouble, even after a half hour at 18 degrees. So it varies. It's a fundamental part of being human. But it also has a shared social reality that has a normative power. So we talk about, when you think about like back that night in Washington, there's a man who, whenever I go from Canal Road, take a right onto Key Bridge to go across the Potomac, he appears to be an elderly alcoholic. It's right near the Dixie liquor store. He comes out there with a cup. He's often wavering. He takes the money. And you know, it was like 18 degrees and he was out there. And I was going, oh, what the hell's got to happen? It's the kind of thing like, do I give him some money? I go, no, he's got to get vodka and drink himself and be outside in the cold and freeze to death. You know, that's the other kind of vulnerability that happens to people. Vulnerability can also have a negative side. When we talk about the elderly as being a particularly vulnerable population, it can lead people to be too nice. So I got a good lesson on that when I was an intern and a 90-year-old lady came in, and I called her by her first name and she wouldn't talk to me. I'm not your old dear. I am Mrs. Smith. Yes, ma'am. I am sorry, ma'am. She goes, have you learned your lesson? Yes, ma'am. We will proceed. Yes, ma'am. So again, you know, the vulnerability can allow an excuse to take somebody's autonomy away from them, so you don't want to do that. The vulnerability to environmental change places not only individuals and populations in danger, and it requires a response. We're on this together. If you look at the islands, say like Vanuatu in the Pacific, where are these very low-lying Pacific islands that are barely above sea level, and they're going to disappear. So those people are uniquely vulnerable. If you look at places, say in all over the world, where climate change is happening now, and people will not have water, people will not have vegetation, food will not grow. That's another vulnerability. For folks like us who are currently in relatively temperate areas, things will get worse, where in other places of the world it's going to be fatal. But the changes that are going to happen, because those people are not going to want to stay in their country, they're going to want to move. If people don't want them to come, they're going to become violent about trying to get safety. So we are all in this together, whether it's because we recognize, say, the face of God on another person who's suffering, or from our own self-interest, that we don't want to be forcibly removed and have to undergo, you know, other trials of that because we don't look and take care of the vulnerability of another. So what vulnerability talks about with Tenhave is, again, criticizing the discourse of contemporary bioethics on empowering individuals in the face of power of science and technology. And so if to get back to the 4 principles from the Georgetown mantra with autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice, the big thing is that autonomy gets overemphasized to the point where you have insane things happening. I don't know if you have it in Canada, but we have it in the United States. You have a patient with widely metastatic cancer who has a life expectancy of days to weeks, who either the patient or the family is demanding he be put on a ventilator. That we had at Loyola has a big, where I worked for 15 years, has a big heart transplant program. A man showed up in his car from southern Illinois, almost dead, crawled into the emergency room, demanding a heart transplant, and he had a metastatic tumor, a kind of tumor called a sarcoma, that had encased his heart so it couldn't beat. So you have to give me a new heart. Well, it doesn't work in that particular situation. The immunosuppressive medicines will make sure that the sarcoma comes right back, et cetera, et cetera. So we get nutty about autonomy in a way that's missing the point of bioethics. What Tenhavi says, confronted with globalization and these big challenges of poverty, inequality, environmental degradation, hunger, pandemics, and human and organ trafficking, this sort of looking at individual cases isn't enough. It needs to be complemented with a broader framework, and he talks about the Universal Declaration of Individual Rights. And he says vulnerability is a necessary component of an ethical framework that includes solidarity, care, and social responsibility. As a fundamental expression of the human condition, vulnerability can only be properly addressed if the social dimension of human existence is taken seriously. So let me just finish up before we get, yeah, good, about 20 minutes for questions. Clinical bioethics currently emphasizes individual relationships in those fields. The practice, though, occurs in a larger world of climate crisis, structural inequality, systemic racism, concerns about race and gender. Placing environmental ethics into a larger field of bioethics gives way to consider new threats. So a limited approach to ensure more sustainable hospital and resource and healthcare, I mean, we need to do something more. How to incorporate this, bring bioethics into the clinical arena is a little confusing, since we need to look at all those problems that come up when you try to think about what's a just allocation of resources, how do you deal with distribution, rationing, other allocation issues. Using vulnerability as a social concern gives a way in which caring for the environment and concern for vulnerable populations, and here's the point, really all of us are a certain way more or less vulnerable, links bioethics and environmental ethics. So thank you very much, and if you can shut off the slides, I appreciate that. And John, do you want to field some questions?
I certainly do. First of all, I want to thank you. Thank you, Myles. So we do have time for questions, as Myles mentioned. Thank you. Let's keep them succinct and to the point. This way everyone gets to answer or ask a question and Myles can answer them. We will also, for those of you who are online, please put your questions in the chat, or no, not the chat function, the Q&A function. So please, if you raise your hand, I'll come around and bring you the microphone so everyone can hear your question, including those who are online. Who would like to begin?
Oh, we're definitely including that. In fact, I think the part of vulnerability, and I've just started reading about this. There's a wonderful book called Afflicted by a woman, Nicole Piemonte, and it looks about the concept of vulnerability in medical education and formation, but it's even broader than that. And she bases a lot of what she talks about in work in continental philosophy, which I'm not good at, so this was an introduction for me. But she talks a look about, she uses some stuff from Emmanuel Levinas, talking about looking at the face of the individual, you know, in French, la visage. So he goes on this riff about la visage in terms of our vulnerability is shared when I, as a physician, look at someone who is in a healthcare crisis. And so the thoughts are, this could be me. I am vulnerable because this person is looking for me to help, and I don't know if I know what to do. This shared vulnerability can lead to a solidarity where we work things out the best way possible together, rather than looking for the doctor as the individual hero or something like that. So I think vulnerability, Den Have in other works calls it the basic principle of bioethics. And so I think it's a useful way to look at it, and it's a way to sometimes get away from medical hubris, because it also emphasizes that there is a vulnerability on the part of the physician or the nurse, the other healthcare, the other clinicians, that's important to understand. If we don't operate out of that vulnerability, then we just become arrogant jerks, which regrettably the numbers are legion, both in the priesthood and in the medical profession. So. Well, duty, and the other question is mistrust or distrust, because that's a fundamental part of the Western mindset now. Don't tell me what to do. And there are reasons for that. Again, you know, if you look about the church, well, wonderful, we did a great job with abusing kids, and don't tell me that, don't talk about it, or other things that go on. So there's reasons for the distrust. I think the question is, and the part that's hard about vulnerability, is we have large parts of the population who don't think they're vulnerable and who are not concerned about other people's vulnerability. And the issue is how do you create a society where we understand that we are vulnerable? I mean, I think one of the theological things, not to get too churchy, but if you look at the vulnerability of God, you cannot get more vulnerable than that baby that was born. You know, when you look at Jesus and go, that's God, that doesn't get more vulnerable. And that's an important part of, I think, a catechesis that looks at solidarity and vulnerability as a way in which, you know, not only do we find God, but we find each other. How to do that for a larger society where you have people who are very libertarian, or people who are free market capitalists in a way, excessive free market capitalists, I put it, laissez-faire capitalists. It's going to be hard. I mean, I don't think vulnerability is a magic wand. I do think it has explanatory power that allows you to look at different things and come up with new solutions. It's a little bit like a model in the sciences. You know, when we had the original idea that the atom was like the solar system, yeah, you could explain a lot of different things. And then you realized you had to get to quantum physics to understand others, and now we're finding the quantum model isn't working. I think vulnerability is a model to look at as a way that helps us look at some of the shared problems we have, recognizing it won't give all the answers, and that the biggest thing is that, as always, it requires the ability of an individual to look beyond his or her own narrow self-interest. The problem with the people who just look at their narrow his or her own self-interest is they don't realize how vulnerable they are, you know. Not well. And I mean, the question, could you hear the question? Great. And so, you know, with looking to I have like programmatic answers to things about organ transplantation where there should be strict sets of criteria that really do not look at somebody's wealth and power and stuff like that. So if someone who's wealthy and powerful is able to get a liver transplant that perhaps was contraindicated, it's totally wrong. That's a failure. The issue about distributing things like vaccine rather than hoarding them, that continues to be wrong. But again, it has to do with this failure to recognize the vulnerability, a sort of stupidity to realize that if we don't vaccinate other populations, then the virus is going to continue to mutate and come up with other troubles. It's again the failure of the lack to realize that solidarity is not just being nice and warm, it really is an element of enlightened self-interest that looks at us as mutually vulnerable. How I go from those beautiful words to changing people's hearts and minds, I don't know. Yeah, and I think at its best, the social teaching of the church can avoid some of the more, as you put it, moralistic, this procedure's wrong, this procedure's allowable, when it looks at things particularly about, one of the things that keeps on coming up in the States is people get amazed that the church says that decisions about a particular treatment can be made on the patient's own sense of the burden, and that burden can include economic burden. So, if an individual doesn't have insurance and has put $50,000 away in the bank and develops an exotic illness that's got to wipe out the resources, but he has 3 kids, he doesn't have to spend those $50,000. That's a failure of American society. I'm not saying, oh, good. But what I'm saying is you are allowed to look at different parts of a decision in a holistic way. I don't know if you remember about 30, 40 years ago, Oregon tried to reform insurance within that particular state, and they came up with a policy that, for instance, there was widespread vaccination for kids under 6 and limited treatment for unusual malignancies. And so what happened? A beautiful little boy, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, lovely little kid got this wild malignancy, and it wasn't going to be covered by Oregon. So that child was put on the front of every newspaper and all the other stuff, and the state of Oregon ended up spending, about 10% of their vaccine budget on trying to keep that kid alive. So, again, we do our rationing sometime on the basis of publicity rather than looking at societal impact. And the church does not have a problem with trying to look at the common good as a basis for which you make decisions.
So just prior to taking more questions from the in-person audience, there are a couple of online questions. First one, are we to integrate systems ethics with individual ethics? We've always been taught that we cannot do systems ethics at the bedside.
I think that that's part of what I'm saying, is that you have to be very careful about making, say, bedside rationing decision. When I was practicing, I didn't have a problem if a patient is demanding that they have an MRI and they don't need it. I'd say no. I'm not saying no because I'm trying to ration care. It's a waste of money. If a patient comes in with an obvious cold, I'm not going to give them a prescription for, an expensive antibiotic. So part of that decision is just sort of basic medical care. The next question, though, about making societal decisions in the face, particularly in the States, this is a big conversation I have with my students. They go, well, this is wasteful and all the other stuff, so I don't think it's right. I go, you cannot make quality of life decisions or other decisions that the government or that the people of the United States have refused to answer. It's not fair for you to become the arbiter of social spending within our country when the country has refused to do it. Your job is to come up with the best possible medical care for that person. Doesn't mean you're wasteful, but it doesn't mean you say no on the basis of your feelings. So I think that, individual ethics are always going to be important at the bedside, but they exist within a social contract. If the social contract looks more about things at vulnerability and solidarity, my hope is that will in time lead to more individuals looking at making decisions from a way that could have consequences other than for themselves. And I must say, it's very common for my older patients to say, no, I've lived a good long life. I am not going to do that. I'm not going to go through all those things. So I don't think we're that far away, but there's going to be a conflict. And the conflict will probably always continue to be at some extent. But I think the broader issue is, can we come up with a social ethic that isn't just based on money, but it's based on our shared humanity?
The second question, can we see vulnerability in God's creation, the planet, the flora and fauna?
Absolutely. I think, our whole environment is vulnerable to the changes that are going on right now. In a certain way, if you spend a lot of time in the outdoors, there's a lot of vulnerability and a lot of viciousness that goes on in nature. You don't want to be a little mouse trying to run through the field when the hawks are out. But I think recognizing our responsibility for that vulnerability and the ways in which there is an interconnection between our lives and what happens with the natural world is, again, a part of that solidarity that can go beyond simply our own species. She hasn't taken it other than I think she references it in terms of some of her stuff with solidarity. And the part is I actually got hot on Ten Javi in the last few months, and I did the Ricci stuff before, so I haven't looked back to see how much she references it.
How do you think it would inform your critical response to Ricci? I mean, how do you see vulnerability?
I think part of it is, one of the things that's interesting just about how everybody's together is Ten Javi was influenced and continues to be influenced by the work of Pellegrino. And so he looks a lot at what Pellegrino's philosophy was, the internal morality of medicine, which the fundamental goal of the clinician-patient relationship is to find the right and good healing action for the person before you. It depends on a fourfold good. The least important is the biomedical good, and the others are the good that the person says. The good is a person qua person, in other words, respecting their own autonomy, being beneficent, and the final is the patient's deepest spiritual good. I think that what vulnerability does is it requires the clinician to engage in that values discussion with the person in front of her or him in making serious medical decisions. And I think that somehow, I don't think Ricci has fully engaged that. And again, she's trying to get her thesis done. She's come up with a great idea. She didn't go through everything. And I think that's a part where she might develop it as well. But I mean, one of the things that Ten Javi has written about is we need to look more at vulnerability in the context of what Pellegrino and Tomasma, his partner, wrote about, to see how that would look. It's a hot issue. It's a complicated one. And my look at bioethics is colored by my Catholic perspective and stuff, which causes both insights and sometimes things you worry about. In terms of like safe needles and things like that, to allow people to make sure that they're not going to get hepatitis and things, in terms of even supervised sites where individuals, if they do overdose, can be cared about, I think you can look at it as a harm reduction. The problem is that there's something basically wrong with people taking drugs, and thus you're sort of cooperating with it. There's a way in which I think you could justify it. I think it's better than having all these people dying. I think the deeper thing to look at is, as a society, this comes up with when I'm doing my introduction to ethics, Catholic ethics, is to look at structures of sin. In other words, if I look at, say, in the American Midwest, the problems with drug addiction. So the companies move out. You have large groups of people without jobs or without hope. There's despair, there's loneliness, there's breakdown in families. There's a variety of different things where, in some ways, yes, it is their decision to take these drugs, but there's not a hell of a lot else to do. And so, again, it gets back to vulnerability and solidarity. Can we look at the vulnerability of these populations where all the big firms have gone away, leaving places to decay? Or do we just say, oh, they're just poor schmucks, capitalism left them behind, why don't they move? Why don't they move to California? Why don't they become, computer programmers? Why don't they do this, that, and the other thing? As opposed to saying, as people with shared humanity, that could happen in my town, that could happen to my son and daughter. How could we look at a way in which there's ways to provide, things like a universal basic income, other ways to make sure that people do not have such desperation. So I didn't entirely answer your question except to hint at the complexity of it.
So we have time for one more question, I think. I'll hand it off so that people online can.
Yeah, there is an attempt to limit some of the disposables. There's also an attempt to, re-engineer the hospital building so there's much more energy efficient. But I knew, so in 1980 when I went to medical school, if you're in the operating room, you get a nice clean cloth gown. Now you get this plastic smock that's got to be thrown away. If you were going to do a procedure on a patient, There would be a tray that would be individually sterilized, and things would be used over. Now it's this big plastic thing with, it's everything you have to open and all the other stuff, and it's all thrown away. We're seeing some returns to reusing things that can be, completely sterilized, used again. It'll be slow, and it's also partly slow because here's another thing, the vast sterilization stuff that we used to have in hospitals isn't there anymore. The vast laundries we used to have are not there anymore. So there are ways in which progress has exacerbated the problem and made it harder to go back to a more simplistic version that was actually better for the environment and didn't harm patients.
Father Sheehan, Dr. Sheehan, I think Myles, both of those roles, though, I think played into the beauty of your talk and the complexity of it. And the questions I think we all have to wrestle with at a social and individual level. I thank you so much. Will you please join me in thanking Myles for his talk? Folks, why don't you stay outside the door and to the right. We will have refreshments for you. You can continue the conversation. Apart from thanking Myles, I want to thank Fang Chandra, Kevin Eng, student volunteers, some of whom are still here working late at night. For a small college, this kind of buy-in from people is so important, and we're really thankful for all of their hard work and volunteering. So let's thank them as well.
If people want a copy of the talk, you're welcome to it, so feel free to send it out.
Oh, fantastic. So if you didn't hear that, you can get a copy of that talk, and we will send it out to you. Just shoot us an email. All right.
If you steal it, say you stole it from me. Okay?
It's only ethical to do that. All right, we'll see you shortly. Thank you.